In 1948, Israel achieved statehood in a very small area. Um, During the first Arab Israeli wars, they were able to achieve statehood, still surrounded by multiple Arab states that became their sworn enemies. During that time, there was multiple contested lands. Tensions increased between the state of Syria, the Arab state of Syria, the state of Jordan, the state of Egypt. All of the surrounding Arab states did not recognize Israel and did not believe that they deserved recognition, having their own country, and to enjoy recognition in the UN as a state. As tensions increased, it became apparent that Israel was in need of maintaining access to the Sea of Galilee in order to provide fresh water for its population. Syria had begun undermining that during these digging of the canal in order to circumvent this from being able to happen, and Israel being able to utilize the Sea of Galilee as a good fresh water source. Tensions further increased when um, President Nasser had made threats against the state of Israel, continuous for the United Nations, made very direct threats as to what he would do to the state of Israel militarily. Um, During that time frame in 1967, UN peacekeeping troops that were in place in that area had been withdrawn, leaving Nasser with sudden realization that there is nothing now standing in between himself, the other Arab states, and the state of Israel, which, having been spent hundreds of years, thousands of years, being persecuted by its Arab neighbors, and having spent many years dealing with the atrocities that occurred during World War II, Israel decided to take their Israeli Defense Forces and form the first offensive of the 1967 Six Days War. Israel decided to make that first day an air campaign, a very successful air campaign, in which it was able to attack and neutralize the air power of Egypt and Syria. Um, Succeeding days of the campaign found Israel in a mechanized war with the mechanized divisions of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Egypt, with strong air support from its air force, was able to easily defeat these forces, eclipsing the casualty rate. That Egypt suffered was far eclipsed by the casualty rate suffered by its Arab foes. Egypt was able to capture territories during that 6 days war, most notably the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip and West Bank. The Gaza Strip and the West Bank became the catalyst for many years of violence and terrorism, as it was occupied by over 1 million Palestinian Arabs who had settled there. Now suddenly under Israeli rule, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled over the years, but the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was a military arm of Palestine, continued terrorist campaigns against the state of Israel. At times, over the years, there were many attempts at peace, at striking a peace accord. Um, Over the 1982 peace agreement, had Israel, between Israel and Egypt, had Israel returning territories that it had taken from Egypt. Uh, but in August of 1967, still seething from their defeat in the 6 Days War, Arab leaders met in Sudan and signed a resolution that promised no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation with Israel ever, making Israel an enemy state to all Arab nations. Claiming the Gaza Strip and the West Bank as its own territory, Israel continued to suffer many attacks, terrorist attacks, and there were many conflicts and minor skirmishes that occurred over the years. Eventually, as part of a peace treaty, Israel, having returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in 1982, Israel also withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, but it's continued to occupy and settle other territories claimed during the 6 Day War. And the terrorist activity in the terrorist support states has only increased since then. Other state-sponsored terrorist countries such as Syria, Iran, and others continue to promote terrorist campaigns and terrorist organizations that will attack Israeli ideas and also those of the United States, who is a strong ally of Israel. The terrorist campaign, I believe, has grown and flourished as an alternative means to attack Israel, as the other Arab states found out in 1967 that they severely underestimated the ability of Israel to wage war and to defend itself against a united Arab attack. Not wanting to be embarrassed again and not having the capabilities or the power to attack Israel, who is strongly supported by its ally, the United States. The Arabs nations seem content to just sponsor the terrorist organizations that continue to attack Israel, the United States, and in support of its hatred of Israel and its ideals. Thank you.